There is a sound that comes before everything else in this work. Before the drop from transit space, before the range lock confirmations, before the admiral gives the order or the gunners find their marks, before any of that, there is the sound of a transmission you cannot fully hear. I have been listening to 19 seconds of it for 6 years. My name is Lena Sorvik. In the 9th year of my service to the Expeditionary Communications Division, I held the rank of Senior Signal Interpreter, 2nd grade, assigned to the fleet carrier Carven Shore under Admiral de Saroth. My posting was unremarkable by any objective measure. I decoded fragmentary long-range signals, rebuilt corrupted transmissions from raw carrier wave, reconstructed meaning from noise and distance and damage. I was good at the work in the way that quiet people are good at quiet things, not through natural brilliance but through the kind of patient, recursive attention that most people grow impatient with inside of an hour and that I found, for reasons I have never satisfactorily explained to anyone including myself, genuinely absorbing. I had been offered 2 promotion tracks in my first 8 years that would have moved me into administrative coordination. I had declined both. I liked the signals bay. I liked the particular quality of attention the work demanded. I did not seek the assignment I received. It found me in the way that the worst assignments always find the people least prepared for what they will have to carry, which is not to say unprepared in skill, but unprepared in the specific and private way of not having understood yet that some work changes the person doing it, and that you cannot know, before you sit down to it, which work will do that. On the morning of what later became known as the crossing event, I was 31 years old and 4 months into a 9-month tour. I was asleep in my bunk when the alarm went. I was on the bridge in 4 minutes, in my service jacket with the collar undone and my boots unlaced because I had not waited to do either. The duty officer, a man named Hal Preece, who had a way of delivering bad information with the specific flatness of someone trying not to add weight to what is already heavy, showed me the feed without comment. Maren's crossing was gone. The station had been one of the oldest neutral communication relays in that region of space, a jointly maintained hub, 40 years in operation, funded partly by Earth and partly by 3 allied species under the Meridian Compact. It was not a military installation. It had no armament. Its hull was striped in the pale green of recognized neutral infrastructure under the Conclave's own charter, the same charter the Vithrani had helped write, the same charter that was displayed prominently in the Conclave's public documentation as evidence of their commitment to protected status infrastructure. Its function was to relay, amplify, and archive signals passing through a broad corridor of that transit lane, everything from commercial traffic to personal correspondence to the long, thin streams of diplomatic exchange that kept the region's politics from degenerating into open conflict. It employed 94,000 people. Humans, yes, but also Kethani infrastructure technicians, Sorrel communications staff, a small Asavari archival team that had been stationed there for 11 years, compiling what I later learned was an archive of a particular kind. On the feed there was nothing where the station had been. Not damage, not debris dispersal, not the diffuse cloud of superheated particulate that a catastrophic internal failure leaves, which spreads outward over hours and is readable in the residual thermal return. Nothing that suggested partial destruction or a cascading structural collapse. The sensor return was clean in the way that a deliberate erasure is clean. The site was swept. The station's mass had been removed with the kind of specificity that only one category of action produces. The feed took 30 seconds to resolve the picture properly, and in that 30 seconds I understood, standing on the bridge of the Carven Shore in my unlaced boots with the collar of my jacket open, that we were looking at something that had been done to us. What we did not know yet was why. What I did not know yet was that the why would become my work for 6 years, and that at the end of those 6 years, the answer to it would be waiting in the signals bay of a different ship, On a morning when the filing timestamp of the Conclave's sixth and final denial matched exactly the drop coordinates of 389,000 warships. Priest pulled up the last archived signal window from the station's outgoing relay. The station had been transmitting normally until 47 minutes before the sensor return confirmed its absence. 43 of those 47 minutes were filled with the kind of routine traffic that stations like Maren's Crossing handled continuously. Commercial clearances, a quarterly archive sync from the Asavari team, bandwidth allocation records, a personal message from one of the human technicians, to a family address in the Meridian cluster that would never be received because the relay chain it was routed through no longer had a Maren's Crossing to pass through. In the final 4 minutes before the station went dark, the pattern changed. A signal had come in, not out, in. The station had received something from inside the Asavari cluster, from deep inside it, from a source point that the carrier frequency indicated was a private transmission rather than any official Conclave channel. The logs showed that the station had begun to relay and amplify that signal outward, through the crossing's main transmission array, into the broad corridor it served. The relay had run for 3 minutes and 11 seconds before the station's logs ended. The total length of the signal was unknown. What I captured, because I was on duty and it was my board that caught the trailing edge of the relay as it punched through a secondary sensor array aboard the Carven Shore, was 19 seconds. 19 seconds of something the station had thought important enough to relay at full amplification the moment it arrived. 19 seconds of something that someone had died to transmit. The signal was in Asavari. That was the first thing I could confirm before I had decoded a word of it. The carrier frequency, the encoding structure, the rhythmic packet spacing that characterized Asavari long-range private communication. It was not military. It was not official diplomatic communication. It was the encoding format a private individual or a small group would use to send a message that needed to travel far. The second thing I could confirm was that it was a distress signal, not the short, sharp standard format emergency beacon that the Conclave's charter required all species to use for infrastructure failure or navigational hazard. This was a message. Someone was talking. Someone had needed to tell the world something badly enough to transmit it through Maren's Crossing on a broadband relay that would have bounced it through 6 secondary hubs and eventually reached every monitoring station in the sector. I spent the first day trying to decode it and failing. The second day partially succeeding. The third day understanding that partial success was going to be the condition of this work for a long time, and that the work was going to take as long as it took. I filed a preliminary report on day 4. It said, incoming signal in Asavari encoding, content partially recoverable, analysis ongoing. It did not say, I think I know what this is. It did not say, I think the station was destroyed because of this signal. I had 4 days of data and a partial encoding. What I had was not enough to say those things in a report. What I had was enough to think them in the dark between shifts, lying in my bunk listening to the ship's circulation systems, trying not to let the thought become a certainty before the evidence supported certainty. It became a certainty anyway, inside of 2 weeks. The certainty and the evidence did not arrive together. The evidence took longer. The Asavari were not a powerful species. They were a quiet one. They had been affiliated with the Vithrani Conclave for 80 years under what the Conclave called a resource partnership agreement, a designation that translated imprecisely into a variety of configurations depending on how charitably you read the original document, and that translated with perfect precision if you read it uncharitably. They produced agricultural goods. They provided raw biological material for Conclave pharmaceutical processing. They occupied 17 small worlds in a cluster that the Conclave had classified, some 40 years earlier, as annexed productive territory. The last independent census of their population had been conducted 22 years ago, before the Conclave had restricted external access to the Asavari cluster, under a governance consolidation measure that had been filed, noted, and not meaningfully opposed by any member of the regional diplomatic community, including Earth. The census had placed their population at a little over 900 million. Nobody had conducted a census since. When the crossing event was formally logged with the Conclave's diplomatic office, the response came within 6 hours. I remember reading it on my screen in the signals bay and nodding the response time. 6 hours. The station had employed 94,000 people, and its disappearance represented one of the most significant infrastructure losses in that region of space in 40 years. And the Conclave had a full explanation filed and formatted and transmitted within 6 hours of the official report. The Conclave expressed regret for the loss of the infrastructure asset and the associated personnel. They attributed the destruction of Maren's crossing to a navigational incident involving an unregistered transit wake from a mass displacement drive operating outside authorized transit lanes. They said the drive's signature had been traced. Within 6 hours, they had already traced it to a vessel of unknown origin, probably a decommissioned bulk freighter operating without Conclave clearance. They said an internal review had been opened. They said they would file a full report within 90 days. I read it and I looked at the 19-second signal file on my secondary screen, and I made a note in my private log that said, 6 hours, nothing else, just the number. That was the first denial. There were 6 of them over 6 years. I want to be precise about the 19 seconds, because precision is what it deserved, and because imprecision would be a small betrayal of something that deserved none. The encoding was a compressed voice and data hybrid. The Asavari used this format for long-range personal transmissions, the kind that crossed the distances between their cluster worlds and the relay hubs at the edges of Conclave space. It was not an uncommon format, but it was not one that Earth's signal reconstruction systems had been optimized for, because Asavari communications had not historically been a priority of Earth's intelligence or diplomatic infrastructure. The Conclave discouraged external study of its affiliated species. The available tools were not adequate to the material, and the first 3 months of my work on the signal were primarily the work of building better tools. I adapted a reconstruction algorithm designed for fragmented Sorel encoding. I built a dictionary supplement from every piece of Asavari linguistic material available in Earth's combined archive, which was less than I wanted and more than I had initially expected. There was a small academic database compiled by a xenolinguistics team whose work the Conclave had formally objected to twice, which had not been published in any official channel, but which existed in the research archives of a university I contacted through the division's academic liaison office. The lead researcher, a woman named El Vaso who had spent 15 years working on Asavari language structure and who had not been permitted into the Conclave's territory for the last 8 of those years, sent me her complete working files inside of a week of my request. She asked no questions about why I needed them. I have thought about her often since, about what she understood from the nature of the request without needing to be told. The structural grammar she had developed, in collaboration with 2 other xenolinguists who had since moved to other projects, was the foundation of everything I did in the first year. It was a contested document. The 3 authors disagreed on several key structural points, and the disagreements were annotated throughout. But it was the most complete description of Asavari grammatical architecture that existed outside the Conclave's own suppressed academic institutions. I treated the contested points as variables and ran reconstructions against multiple possible interpretations, flagging results by confidence level, and keeping all viable readings in the working file. This was slow work. It was the right kind of slow work because the alternative, moving faster and accepting lower confidence, would have produced a result I could not stand behind. The account had to be exact. I understood that from very early on, though I could not have told you exactly why I understood it at the time. I understand it now. The denials were going to be procedural, and the only answer to a procedural denial was a document so exact that the procedure had no purchase on it. Of the 19 seconds I had, 11 were recoverable at some level. Of those 11, 3 were clean enough for direct translation. The remaining 8 required reconstruction. I spent 4 months on the first 3 seconds, not because I was slow, because I was careful. In the first 3 clean seconds, I found a name, a time marker, and a number. The name was a place referent. The closest analog and standard was something like the place we were given, or the place we were told to tend. The Asavari word for their own homeworld, and for each of the 17 worlds in their cluster used the same root, a possessive relational structure that bound place and people in a single construction, so that the word for world and the word for home were not different words but different inflections of the same concept. The place we were given. Not discovered, not settled, not built, given. It carried the history of how they had come to occupy those worlds inside the grammar of the word. The time marker meant now, in this moment, while this is happening. The number was 440 million. I sat with that number for a long time before I filed anything. I looked at it for the better part of a day. I checked the Asavari population census from 22 years earlier, 900 million, give or take, spread across 17 worlds. I checked the Conclave's own public filings on productivity indices for the annexed productive territory. The productivity indices had risen. They had risen substantially over the preceding 15 years, and the resource extraction rates had climbed in parallel. And the biological processing quotas filed with the Conclave's Central Bureau had been revised upward 3 times in the same period. 900 million to 440 million. I wrote that number in my log. I wrote it and I stared at it and I understood what it was before I could prove it. The proof took 2 more years. The understanding was immediate, the way that some things are immediate, not deduced but recognized, the way you recognize a shape you have seen before from a different angle. The second denial came 14 months after the first. The Conclave filed its initial review of the crossing event and reiterated the transit wake explanation. They noted, as a supplementary item, that the station's records could not be fully recovered due to the destruction of the relay core, and that no independent sensor data of sufficient resolution existed to contradict their finding. They acknowledged the loss of 94,000 lives and expressed renewed regret. They indicated that the matter was under ongoing administrative review, but that no new evidence had been presented that warranted reopening the primary finding. By then I had recovered 4 more seconds of the 19, using the revised algorithm and the supplementary dictionary. The 4th second of clean signal contained a verb construction and a subject that together meant, "They are not stopping." The construction had an aspect marker that the structural grammar flagged as indicating something prolonged, not a single act but a sustained condition, a state of affairs that had been true for some time and showed no sign of resolution. The 5th second had a word that every translator who had worked with Asavari records recognized, the word that the Conclave's own charter in its Asavari translation rendered as protected. But in the structural grammar, 2 of the 3 xenolinguists had noted that the word had a secondary register, asked for help, or called for witness, or sought recognition. The Conclave's translation had chosen the first register. The grammar's authors had argued for the second. The secondary register was not inherently incompatible with the primary. In context, a thing can be both protected and calling for witness. But the grammatical position of the word in this sentence, the relationship it had to the verb construction in the preceding second, placed it firmly in the second register. The speaker was not describing a protected status. They were describing an act of seeking. The 6th second was fragmentary but contained enough to identify an address, a direction, an intended recipient. The signal was not being sent into the void. It was being sent to someone in particular. The Asavari embedded the recipient's identity into the grammatical structure of the message itself, using a vocative form that made the recipient part of the sentence. You did not address the message to someone. You spoke to them directly, and in speaking to them, you acknowledged the relationship between you. I could not recover the vocative in full. What I could recover was the root of it, and the root referred to someone with the capacity to respond, someone who was not in the same situation as the speaker, someone who was free. It was addressed to anyone who was free to hear it. The third denial came 18 months later. By then I had been transferred, not just I, and not just the carven shore, but the whole of what Admiral Roth had quietly been assembling since 6 months after the crossing event. The conversation between Roth and the full Admiralty Council had taken place across several months in secured channels, and I was not party to it, but I was aware of the outcome. The work I had been doing was formally elevated. Incorporated was the word used in the memo I received, which was the bureaucratic term that meant your findings are now part of a larger accounting, one that extends beyond your particular piece of it. Stay at the work. Be exact. There were others. I did not know at the time how many, but there were other analysts at other postings working related problems, other pieces of the picture. Intelligence assessors who had spent years cross-referencing the Conclave's biological processing quotas against plausible workforce capacities in the Asavari cluster. Economists who had mapped resource extraction rates against population projections. Historians who had studied the sequence of the Conclave's charter amendments in the years following the Resource Partnership Agreement, and had noted which protections, one by one, had been quietly restructured out of the text over 4 decades. Not removed dramatically, not excised in ways that invited challenge, but revised in small increments, each increment individually explicable as an administrative clarification, collectively representing the systematic removal of every meaningful constraint on what the Conclave could do with an annexed species. Each of us had a piece of the picture. The picture assembled from those pieces was not difficult to read once you had them. It was only difficult to look at directly, for the same reason it is difficult to look directly at something very bright, not because the light is weak, but because there is so much of it. The Conclave had been reducing the Asavari population in a systematic and deliberate way for approximately 15 years. The mechanism was not a single violent act but a sustained policy, carried out through layered administrative processes. Labor assignment systems that concentrated certain age cohorts in high mortality extraction environments under productivity schedules that the Conclave's own safety standards did not technically prohibit, but that no independent body had been permitted to audit. Nutritional distribution standards for the annexed productive territory that had been revised downward 3 times in the previous decade, each revision filed as a budget normalization measure. Medical care allocations calibrated in ways that the Conclave's economic models showed would suppress reproduction rates across the cluster within 2 generations. It was not the brute speed of a massacre. It was the administrative patience of an institution that had been doing this for long enough that the procedure had become routine. The people making the decisions were not, in any individual sense, behaving outside the norms of their own institutional culture. They were processing allocation decisions. They were managing resource productivity. They were implementing charter provisions that their own legal apparatus had made entirely permissible. The horror of it, when you understood it fully, was not in its violence but in its ordinariness, in the way it had been constructed to look, from the outside, like nothing more than the normal operation of a governing institution that had a lot of worlds to manage. 440 million, the signal said. In the time between the last independent census and the transmission from Maren's crossing, the Asavari had lost nearly half their number. Maren's crossing had not been destroyed by an unregistered transit wake. It had received the Asavari signal, had begun to relay it broadly as its function required, and had been destroyed in the 4 minutes before that relay could fully propagate. The Conclave's response time 6 hours to file a denial, with a complete explanation ready, was consistent with something that had been planned. The ship whose transit wake they blamed did not exist. We found the discrepancy in year 3, buried in a public navigation filing. The drive signature the Conclave cited in the first denial did not match any mass displacement drive type registered in their own navigation bureau. A made-up ship leaving a made-up signature, in a denial filed within 6 hours. They had been ready. They had destroyed a neutral station. They had killed 94,000 people. They had done it to silence a transmission that would have told the sector what was happening to the Asavari. And then they had filed 6 denials over 6 years, using their own procedural architecture as a wall. I want to be clear about what those 6 years felt like, because I think clarity on that point matters, and because the temptation is to describe them in a way that is more dramatic than the truth. The truth is that they felt like work. Sustained, specific, relentless work. The same kind of attention I had always brought to the signals bay, now focused on a single problem for a length of time that exceeded any previous assignment by an order of magnitude. There was grief in it. I will not pretend otherwise. The Asavari archival team aboard Maren's crossing, 7 people, whose names I eventually recovered from the station's last personnel manifest, were among the 94,000. I thought about them often. A team that had been compiling a record for 11 years, that had found a way to get that record to a relay station, and that had been killed in the 4 minutes before the relay completed. I thought about how close it had been. 19 seconds of the transmission had reached us. If the Conclave had been 4 minutes faster, if the decision to act had been made at a different level, by a different officer, at a slightly shorter interval, nothing would have reached us at all. The station would have gone dark and the explanation would have been filed, and the record would not exist anywhere outside the Conclave's own suppressed archives. 4 minutes. That is how close the margin was. 4 minutes and 11 seconds of relay time, and the signal was in space, and 19 seconds of it found the Carven Shore's secondary sensor array before everything went quiet. But grief was not the dominant register of those 6 years, because grief was not what the work required. What it required was the specific quality of attention I have always been able to give to signals: patient, recursive, exact. Every fragment I recovered, every cross-reference I filed, every revised translation I submitted was a brick in something that was being built on Earth's side of the accounting. And what was being built on Earth's side was not a grievance. It was a document. An unassailable, complete, procedurally exact account of what had been done. In year 4, I was transferred again, to the fleet carrier Resolute Burden, under Admiral Roth's direct command. By then I had a team, 4 analysts, 2 xenolinguists on secondment from the academic side of Earth's Asavari language project, and a signal processing engineer named Dav O'Connell who had spent 6 months developing a reconstruction algorithm specifically for compressed Asavari voice and data encoding. O'Connell's algorithm treated damaged portions of the signal not as lost data, but as constrained possibilities, using the structural grammar and the known carrier parameters to calculate what phonemic sequences could plausibly fill the gaps, then cross-referencing those possibilities against the vocabulary database and flagging the ones that produced syntactically coherent output. It was slow. It was methodical. It was the best tool anyone had built for this particular problem, and it was built for this particular problem, and it worked. The 4th and 5th denials arrived in years 4 and 5. Each was more elaborate than the last, drawing on the Conclave's own archive of prior rulings on similar cases. Citing precedents from their charter's adjudication history, reinforcing the transit wake explanation with supplementary technical analysis from their own bureaus. Each was, in its way, an impressive document, procedurally complete, internally consistent, thoroughly sourced within the Conclave's own legal framework. The kind of document an institution produces when it has had time to prepare, and when it believes that preparation will be sufficient. I read both of them in full. I read the 5th one twice. I noted what they cited, and I noted what they did not cite. The gaps between what they referenced and what they ignored were as informative as the text itself, in some respects, and I filed both documents in the evidence archive alongside everything else. I flagged every citation. I cross-referenced every precedent they invoked against the actual case records in the Conclave's own public archive. I found 3 places in the 5th denial where the cited precedents did not, on careful reading, support the propositions they were cited to support. I noted those discrepancies and filed them. The account grew more complete with each denial they filed, because each denial gave us more material to annotate. In year 4, the resolute burden had been transferred to a new posting position, and I understood what the position meant before anyone explained it. We were docked at a classified dry dock designation, a facility that did not appear on any public navigation registry, that communicated on encrypted channels only, that had no official name except a code string I am not authorized to reproduce here. I will describe only what I could see from the Signals Bay viewport, which was not much but was enough. The hulls under construction were not like anything in the standard procurement catalog. They were not built to the specifications of patrol cruisers or fleet carriers, or the standard dreadnought designs that Earth's shipyards had produced for 30 years. The design philosophy was different in a way that I did not have the engineering vocabulary to articulate precisely, but that was apparent even at the viewing distance of a Signals Bay viewport. They were built for a specific operation, sized for a specific purpose, their construction priorities legible in the way that something designed to do one thing with total commitment is legible compared to something designed to be useful across a range of scenarios. The scale was also different. Most of what I could see through the viewport on any given day was occupied by hulls, plural, many. The production rate at a facility like the one we were docked at is not a number I have access to, but the evidence of the rate was in what I could see every time I looked up from my board. The tally was not built in one place. It was built in 11 dry dock systems over 5 years, in facilities that operated under classified designation, staffed by crews who had been briefed and had chosen to continue, and who had maintained operational security for the entire period. 5 years of construction across 11 systems, for 389,000 hulls plus supporting logistics infrastructure, the supply lines, the ammunition production, the crew training pipelines, the command architecture that would coordinate that many ships across a multi-system campaign without the kind of coordination failures that turn large formations into liabilities instead of assets. It was, by any objective measure, the most significant sustained production effort in Earth's military history. It was conducted entirely in silence, because silence was what the accounting required. The Conclave needed to believe that its denials were working, needed to believe that the procedural wall was holding, right up until the moment when the drop coordinates resolved, and they understood that the wall had never been the relevant structure. In year 5, O'Connell's algorithm recovered the final 4 seconds of useful signal from the 19. The last 4 seconds did not give us new facts in the way that earlier recoveries had. They gave us the arc of the complete transmission, the grammatical shape of the full message, the relationship between the sections, the beginning and the middle and the end as they were intended to connect. They gave us what the xenolinguistic literature calls voice, the quality of a text that makes it clearly the expression of a specific person speaking about things they knew from where they were, with the particular grammar and vocabulary of that person and that moment. The speaker had been a member of the Asavari archival team aboard Maren's crossing. They had been on the station for 11 years. In the final weeks before the transmission, they had been compiling a record, built from communications that had passed through the station's relay systems over those 11 years, from fragments of data that the Conclave had not successfully suppressed, or had not thought to suppress, from correspondence between Asavari and the cluster and Asavari working on the station. The correspondence had been routine traffic, passing through the relay in the normal course of the station's function, personal messages, family updates, the small details of lives lived at a distance. And embedded in that routine traffic over 11 years had been enough to build a picture that the Conclave would have prevented if it had understood what was being assembled. The record documented the reduction, not in the Conclave's administrative language, not in the clinical vocabulary of productivity indices and resource allocations. In Asavari, in the language of the people who had lived through it, the number 440 million was in it. The names of the 17 worlds were in it. The mechanism, the labor assignments, the nutritional standards, the medical allocations, was in it, described not as policy decisions but as the texture of daily life on worlds where the policy decisions were felt in kitchens and clinics and work schedules. The speaker had believed that if the record existed in enough places, if it reached enough people who were free to receive it and to act on what it said, it could not be silenced retroactively. That even if the station was destroyed, even if the transmission was interrupted, a piece of it would survive somewhere and be enough. They had been right about that. They had been right about exactly that. The sixth denial was filed on a Tuesday in the late spring of year 6, 47 pages. It cited 16 prior conclave adjudications, including the previous 5 denials as precedent for themselves, a recursive structure in which the act of denying something 5 times was offered as evidence that the denial was correct. It formally and finally closed the administrative inquiry into the crossing event. It declared the matter resolved. It recommended that the Meridian Compact partners, Earth included, consider the case settled and redirect any residual concerns toward the procedural channels appropriate for infrastructure compensation claims. The Conclave had been filing documents for 6 years, so had we. I read the 6th denial on my screen in the signals bay of the Resolute Burden. I read it, and I noted the filing timestamp, and I forwarded it to Admiral Roth's secure channel with a 1-line annotation, received. Roth's response came 17 minutes later. It was also 1 line, confirm all sections green. I ran the confirmation. All sections were green. All 389,000 hulls of the Unbroken tally were in position across 23 transitory staging arrays distributed through 11 systems, some of them constructed specifically for this deployment in drydocks that had operated under classified designation for 5 years. All crew were at stations. All targeting packages were current. The operational plan had been rehearsed and rehearsed again for the better part of 2 years. All operational timings had been verified within the hour against the Conclave's own filing calendar, because we had known for 3 months when the 6th denial was going to arrive, and we had set the drop coordinates 6 months before that, and everything had been waiting. I sent back, confirmed all green. The tally dropped from transit space above Vithrani Prime at 06:14 station time, which was the same hour the 6th denial's timestamp recorded. We had built that timing ourselves. The cause and the answer had to be exactly adjacent. The sequence had to be unambiguous to anyone who read both documents, now and later, and understood what they were reading. I was on the bridge of the Resolute Burden when we came through. The drop from transit space produces a particular sensation even at the bridge level, even removed from the direct physics of it. A brief pressure differential, a change in the quality of the ambient vibration as the transit field collapses and the ship's normal drive systems take over primary load. It lasts 2 seconds. In those 2 seconds, if you are at the signals board and your displays are live, you watch the sensor environment resolve from the white noise of transit space into the specific, particular, real environment you have dropped into. What I watched resolve was 389,000 ships appearing in the space above Vithrani Prime at the same moment, from 23 separate transit points distributed across the orbital approach. I have worked with large formation data for most of my career. I have processed the signal environment of fleet operations at various scales. I have never seen anything like that resolution event. The 23 simultaneous transit tiers, the sensor return building as the ships spread into their pre-assigned positions, the scale of it assembling on the display in the way that something you have been preparing for and imagining for 6 years assembles when it finally becomes real. Admiral Roth was at the command console 15 feet in front of me. She watched the display with her hands behind her back and her face in the expression she had worn through most of the operational planning phase, not cold exactly, but resolved, which is a different thing, a more permanent thing, the expression of someone who has made every necessary decision and is now present for its execution. She gave no particular signal when the drop completed. She did not need to. The fleet knew what to do. Vithrani Prime is a heavily populated world. Dense atmosphere, organized surface, 46 orbital installations. A substantial defense fleet, 4,200 hulls, primarily mid-range patrol cruisers and a number of dreadnoughts, crude and competent, and defending a system that was the administrative heart of a 40-world governing body. The Conclave was not a small power. It had maintained that fleet for decades, and had used it for enforcement operations throughout its territory, and had every reason to believe, on the basis of any prior assessment of Earth's military capacity, that it was an adequate deterrent. It was not adequate in the way that a door is not adequate to the thing that is not asking permission to enter. The Tally's opening phase removed the Conclave's orbital defense capability above Vithrani Prime in 11 minutes. The defense fleet engaged the forward elements, a screening formation of approximately 8,000 ships, as their doctrine required. They performed as well as they could perform. Their gunnery was competent, their command structure orderly in the initial exchange, their response to the threat as rational as a response to a 97-to-1 numerical disadvantage could be. The Conclave's fleet did not break or scatter in the first contact phase. They held formation for 8 minutes under conditions that made holding formation effectively pointless. I monitored signals throughout. The Conclave's military communications in the opening phase were orderly, and then less so. The command frequency from Vithrani Prime's primary military orbital went quiet at the 40-minute mark, not because it had been specifically targeted, but because the third wave's orbital clearance package had included all 12 defense-adjacent installations in a single sweep, and the primary command orbital had been among them. What I monitored in the hours after that was the administrative communication network, the Conclave's civilian governance channels, its diplomatic relay systems, its intra-government traffic. I monitored it because that is my function, and because there was information to be found in the pattern of it. What I found was, first, confusion, then the beginning of an understanding of the scale. Then, in a frequency that the Conclave had not encrypted adequately, either through oversight or because they had not believed anything would penetrate far enough to monitor it. A series of transmissions between Conclave administrative nodes that described what was happening in the language of a bureaucracy, attempting to process something that exceeded its frameworks. They filed a protest. On the second hour of the Tally's engagement above Vithrani Prime, the Conclave's diplomatic office filed a formal protest with the Meridian Compact Registry. The protest cited their own charter. It cited the 6 denials. It cited the procedural closure of the crossing event inquiry. It invoked provisions related to unprovoked aggression against Conclave member worlds. I flagged the protest and forwarded it to Roth's log without annotation. She did not respond to it. There was nothing to respond to. The protest was a document. The tally was 389,000 warships. The second phase lasted 19 days. It was not conducted from the Resolute Burden, which maintained orbital position above Vithrani Prime alongside a portion of the Tally's reserve formation, while the active campaign elements distributed across the 40-world Conclave territory. The operational directive was specific. The Conclave's governance infrastructure, military assets, and administrative architecture were to be dismantled, not its populations. The directive was precise on this, and the precision mattered to those of us who had spent 6 years building the account that justified the operation. The account was built on the specificity of what the Conclave had done, and the response had to carry that same specificity, had to be answerable on exactly the same grounds, had to be the kind of thing that could be read alongside the offense and understood as its direct and proportionate answer. Civilian infrastructure was not targeted. Food distribution systems were not disrupted. Medical facilities across all 40 worlds were categorically excluded from the operational packages. The 15 species that made up the Conclave's population base were addressed by public broadcast on the first day of the second phase, in their own languages, told in plain terms what was happening and what was not going to happen to them and why. The broadcast included a summary of the complete accounting, the offense, the 94,000, the Asavari reduction, the 6 denials, the transmitted record from Maren's crossing. It was the first time most of those populations had seen any of that information. The Conclave's information management had been thorough. The broadcast reached every inhabited world in Conclave territory simultaneously, through every open channel. The signal's traffic I monitored across those 19 days was its own kind of record. On the first day, the Conclave's administrative channels attempting to coordinate a response that their command architecture was no longer able to execute, because the command architecture was being removed faster than it could reestablish itself. On the second and third days, the beginning of what I can only describe as the collapse of a procedural certainty. The Conclave had governed through documentation and process for 40 years, and in the administrative traffic, I could see the specific texture of an institution discovering that documentation and process do not function when the conditions that make them operative are no longer present. Filings went unanswered because the offices that received filings no longer existed. Formal protests were transmitted to addresses that no longer had anyone to receive them. Governance functions that had been distributed across 40 worlds and hundreds of administrative nodes simply stopped, one node at a time, as the second phase moved through the Conclave's territory. I am not describing this to suggest the collapse was clean or costless. It was not. The dismantling of a governing institution over 40 worlds, conducted in 19 days, produces disruptions that fall on populations whether or not those populations are the intended targets of the operation. The post-operation reports documented those disruptions, factually, without obscuring them. The decision to conduct the operation at that scale had accounted for them, had weighed them against the alternative of leaving intact the institutional architecture that had permitted 15 years of reduction and 6 years of denial, and had made a judgment. I will not second-guess the judgment here. I will note only that it was made explicitly, documented fully, and is part of the accounting in the same archive that holds everything else. The Asavari cluster was reached on day 11. 4 formation elements, approximately 22,000 ships, transited to the cluster and held position above the 17 worlds. No weapons were discharged in the cluster. The communication package was delivered instead. Notification that the resource partnership agreement was voided, that annexation status was dissolved, that the Conclave had no jurisdiction over any Asavari world or Asavari person from that moment forward. The package included the full accounting. It included the transmitted record from Maren's crossing in its reconstructed form, with the full derivation of how it had been rebuilt. It included El Vasso's structural grammar, fully attributed. The signal's traffic from the Asavari cluster in the hours after the communication package was delivered was unlike anything else I monitored across the 28 days of the operation. I do not have a framework for it that does not risk distorting it. It was not celebratory in any sense I could recognize. It was, and I am choosing this word carefully, because it is the most accurate one available to me, stunned. The traffic had the quality of something that is processing the fact of having been heard, Not the content of the message, not the specifics of what had changed, but the prior fact of its having reached anyone. 11 years. 47 seconds of transmission, of which we had received 19. And then 6 years of answer being built from the outside, which they had not known about, which had arrived for them as the tally arrived. Fully formed, existing, real. I processed that communication package myself. I formatted it. I appended the 19-second fragment in its original form, and then the complete reconstruction as the first 2 exhibits. I had not listened to the original fragment straight through in years, had worked with it in sections, in granular fragments, never start to finish. I listened to it while I formatted. 19 seconds, 11 recoverable. The 3 clean seconds and the 8 rebuilt ones, and the damaged portions at the edges that resolved only into noise and distance. Someone speaking urgently toward a relay array, knowing they had one chance, already knowing, they must have already known, what the transmission would cost. On day 19, the second phase completed. On day 28, the final operational elements returned to the tally's formation. Admiral Roth delivered the close of operation report via command channel. She read it the way she read everything in the operational phase. Flat, specific, exact. Fleet losses, 2,340 hulls, primarily in the first phase engagement above V Thrani Prime. An additional 180 in transit incidents during the second phase distribution. Personnel losses, 14,700. That number, I log it here exactly as it was delivered. It does not round. It does not average. It sits in the accounting in its own place, exactly as the 94,000 and the 440 million sit in theirs, a specific count of a specific cost, recorded without qualification because qualification would be another kind of erasure, and we had spent 6 years refusing to do erasure. I had known some of them. Not many. The tally was a fleet of 389,000 ships, and I was one person on one ship, and the people I knew were the people within the range of knowing. O'Connell had been transferred before the operation to a signals post on a light cruiser in the 6th wave. He came through. Preece, who had been standing at the duty officer's console on the morning the station's sensor return resolved to nothing, had died in year 3, a transit accident aboard a different ship, unrelated to any of this. The kind of loss that does not fit the accounting and that you carry in a separate place. In the days after the operation closed, the signals bay was quiet the way that the end of sustained work is quiet, not peaceful exactly, but the pressure was gone. The specific pressure of 6 years of directed attention toward a single problem. I processed the final operational traffic. I filed the confirmation reports. I updated the transmission logs. The administrative tasks that close a campaign are numerous and detail-oriented, and I was glad of them. They are the kind of work that keeps your hands occupied while the rest of you settles. On the 5th day after the operation closed, I did one more thing. I opened the complete reconstruction of the Asavari transmission, not the 19-second fragment, not the summary exhibit in the communication package. The full document that O'Connell's algorithm and 6 years of work had assembled, 112 seconds of transmission, built from the original 19, extending the recovered content through constrained probability and contextual cross-reference, flagged throughout with certainty levels and analyst annotations, representing the best possible rendering that the evidence permitted. I had built it section by section. I had submitted it as an exhibit. I had used it to construct the account. I had never sat with it as a whole, from beginning to end, in the way that you sit with something when the work of building it is finished, and what remains is only what it says. I sat with it now. The speaker had been on Maren's crossing for 11 years. They had been building the record for most of that time, using what passed through the relay systems, using the correspondence from home that arrived in the station's normal traffic volume, unremarkable individual messages that added up over 11 years, to a picture that could not be suppressed by the Conclave, because the Conclave had not understood what was being compiled from its pieces. The speaker had understood, at some point, what would happen if the record was transmitted. They had transmitted it anyway. The decision embedded in that act, the decision to use the 4 minutes between the receipt of the signal and whatever was coming to do the one thing that could still be done, is not a decision I will characterize, because it does not require characterization. It speaks clearly enough on its own. The transmission was addressed to anyone who was free to hear it. That translation had stood up through everything, 6 years of analysis, every revision, every contested grammatical point resolved and re-resolved. The vocative referred to someone with the capacity to respond, someone outside the situation, someone free. The speaker had not known who would receive it. They had transmitted it to the possibility of receiving, to the condition of someone being free and capable of acting on what they heard. We had received it. We had been free enough to hear it and capable enough to answer it, and we had spent 6 years making the answer exact enough that it could not be denied by the same mechanism that had denied everything else. And then the tally had dropped. I closed the file. I logged out of the signals bay and stood for a moment at the viewport. The tally was still in formation, 389,000 hulls holding position in the space above Vithrani Prime, their forward edges lit by the planet's reflected light, the scale of them visible even from the viewport of a single ship in the middle of that formation, if you looked directly at the display feed rather than through the glass. The Conclave's 40-world administrative infrastructure had been removed. The Asavari cluster's 17 worlds were free of the Resource Partnership Agreement and everything it had permitted. The complete accounting was in the Meridian Compact Archive, the independent diplomatic registry, and Earth's own public record filed simultaneously, so that no single authority had to maintain it, so that it existed in enough places that it could not be erased. 94,000 people. Maren's Crossing. The station the Conclave built its transit-wake fiction to explain in 6 hours because they were ready. The archival team that spent 11 years building a record from what passed through the relay systems. The speaker who had 4 minutes and used them to transmit into the possibility of someone free enough to hear. 440 million. The place we were given, the signal said. The place we were told to tend. 389,000 ships, 28 days, a full accounting. I have been asked since whether the scale of the response was proportionate to the offense. I have been asked this by people who are troubled by it, by people who feel obligated to ask, by people who have already decided what the answer should be and are looking for a specific kind of confirmation from someone who was present. I do not answer that question, because it is not a question the accounting can resolve. The accounting records what was done and what was answered. It cannot close the gap between those two things, because the gap cannot be closed. What was taken from the Asavari in 15 years of systematic reduction is not returned by 28 days of response. 94,000 people and a neutral station do not become not destroyed because the tally dropped. The speaker on Maren's Crossing does not come back. I have also been asked whether we were right. This is a different question, and I will give the only honest answer I have, which is that right is not a framework that resolves cleanly at this scale. What I know is this: an institution deliberately reduced a people by 440 million over 15 years. Behind a legal framework it had constructed to permit the reduction and enforce the silence around it. It killed 94,000 people on a neutral station to prevent a single transmission from completing. It then spent 6 years constructing procedural certainty from documentation it had fabricated. And the answer we gave it was built from the same materials, exact documentation, a complete account, a record assembled with the same procedural precision it had used to deny everything. We matched that precision. We exceeded its scale. We answered in kind and beyond, because beyond was what the accounting required. The question that can be answered is a different one: whether the record was made exact, whether the account was complete, whether the transmission that was sent into the possibility of someone free reach someone who was free, and whether what was heard was answered with the same precision and the same specificity that the original act had been committed. It was. The speaker on Maren's crossing had 19 seconds of relay time and used them to transmit a record of 440 million people to anyone free enough to hear it. We had 19 seconds of signal and 6 years of work and 389,000 ships, and we used all of it. They had called it a navigational accident. They had called it an administrative incident. They had called it a closed inquiry, a resolved matter, a settled case. They had filed 6 denials in 6 years using the procedural architecture of an institution that had learned to construct certainty from documentation rather than fact. The unbroken tally was the truth. That is what we called it. Not justice, because justice implies a balance that this kind of accounting cannot reach. Not punishment, because punishment implies an authority over the punished that we were not claiming. The full accounting. The exact answer to the exact offense. The record completed and deposited in enough places that it could not be erased by any institution, however patient, however procedurally thorough. 94,000 people. Maren's crossing. The station the Conclave built its transit-wake fiction to explain in 6 hours, because they had been ready. The archival team that spent 11 years building a record from what passed through the relay systems. The speaker who had 4 minutes and used them to transmit into the possibility of someone free enough to hear. 440 million, the place we were given, the place we were told to tend. 389,000 ships, 28 days. 19 seconds was all they had. It was enough.